When I was a kid, I wanted to be a private detective, largely because I'd watched too many episodes of the Rockford Files on the telly. As it happened, I didn't become a private detective. I became an archaeologist. But perhaps that's the next best thing, because after all, an archaeologist tells stories about the past from assembled forms of evidence. And I've even joked that archaeology is history's private detective. And what I want to do in this presentation is use some basic detective skills, not necessarily to answer questions, but to ask them. And here I'm interested in the several occasions during the day of the battle when the French broke through the defences at Hougoumont. Now we know that Hougoumont was successfully defended by Wellington's troops throughout the battle. But here I want to explore the question, almost, how close did the French get to taking Hougoumont? And to do that, I'm going to use several forms of evidence and means of explanation, including models. Here, for instance, is a lovely little model of the buildings at Hougoumont. I'm very proud of it. Built it myself out of a kit and painted it up. And it's not necessarily accurate in all areas. For instance, this gate, the north gate, should be further along here. This building here should be much bigger and extend further into the courtyard. We know that from the archaeology. But nonetheless, models like this are useful because they're in 3 dimensions and they allow you to explore things like lines of sight. You can see what from where and how the various spaces work. They also replace missing bits. For instance, if you visit Hougoumont today, you won't see this, the big house in the middle, the chateau. It was burned down during the battle. But here it is, replaced on the model, taking pride of place. We'll also be looking at some good old-fashioned history. And of course, much of our understanding of the Battle of Waterloo comes from the analysis of documents. And we'll be looking at some archaeology as well, don't worry. Now, in order to do that, we're going to go into a presentation. So if we go in here, we should find, there we go, as smooth as you like. We have our basic map. We've got Wellington's troops in red to the north, Napoleon's troops in blue to the south, and here to the front of Wellington's right flank is Hougoumont, the farm and chateau. And if we go to this lovely photograph, you see there in the foreground the building complex with the courtyard. And it becomes obvious here that things are missing. If you compare it to that model I've just shown you, the big house would have been in here. There's the chapel at the back that was actually attached to the house, but still survives. There's the great barn, which survived, but a lot of buildings have gone. Beyond that is the walled garden, 200-meter long wall here facing south, which was loopholed and defended by Wellington's troops. In front of it, that expanse of open ground, which later became known as the killing ground, and the French had to cross that under hail of musket fire to try and get at the defenders, but only after they'd fought their way through the wood to the south. Open fields now, the trees were cut down after the battle, and these 3 big chestnut trees here are the only remnants of that wood. And further away still is where the great orchard stood. This was, as the name suggests, a large area of fruit trees surrounded by hedges and ditches on 3 sides, and then the wall of the garden on its western side. Again, the trees were cut down after the battle. Now that was fought over throughout the day of the battle, but I'm not going to talk about that, nor am I going to talk about the garden. They will be the subject of my next presentation. Here, we're going to focus on the buildings themselves and the various times at which the French got inside. So let's go and look at that briefly from above. There you've got the building complex to the west, the garden, the killing ground to the south, and the orchard further east. And there's that big area of woodland, just huge open fields now. The French attacked in this direction, coming up across the killing ground, assaulting the wall, through the orchard and also around the western side of the complex. First up, we're going to look at the North Gate. But before we do that, look at this perspective here along the west wall. And we have various accounts of the fight from combatants. And here I'll draw out one of the most famous, written up by Matthew Clay, who was a soldier in the 3rd Foot Guards, the Scots Guards. And he describes early on in the battle fighting his way back along the outside of these buildings with the French really in pursuit with a comrade, and they eventually managed to get through the North Gate, which is around here. And we'll come back to Matthew Clay's account to explore various aspects as we progress. But the North Gate probably represents one of the most famous incidents in the Battle for Hougoumont, and indeed the wider Battle of Waterloo. And it's nowhere better expressed than here in James Cowan's famous painting from 1903, which shows both Scots Guards and Coldstream Guards pushing the gates closed, forcing the French back. As it happened, the French got inside. Between 30 and 40 French soldiers got inside through the gates into the courtyard, but were very soon after cut down. A lot of them were probably shot down in close quarter fighting while the gates were closed behind them. At least that's how the story goes. So they got in, but they didn't get far. Now this chap here, before we leave this painting, we can't go without naming this gentleman with the sword. This is Lieutenant Colonel James Mcdonald of the Coldstream Guards, and he was in overall command at Hougoumont, and we'll meet him again very soon. If we look at the historical mapping, this is de Craan's map from late 1815, which shows the battle. Here you've got the building complex, the buildings blocked out in black. There's the North Gate, and you can see from this that even though the French got through the gate, they still then weren't in the courtyard. There's this small enclosed space with buildings almost on 3 sides. To get into the main courtyard here, they've got to pass through this very narrow gap, like a bottleneck. And it seems highly likely that many of them never made it through there. There would be soldiers on these high walls shooting down on them. You know, they'd be kettled in there. It'd be like shooting fish in a barrel. Must have been a dreadful melee, hellish to imagine, let alone even being there. Now, if we look at what the archaeology tells us, here we have one of our trenches just inside the gate. But if we look on this painting, which was made not long after the battle, which shows some of the buildings that were damaged by fire and then demolished, there's the North Gate. There's a huge barn or stables next, just to the left of the gate as you go inside. You can see the size of that and how far it extends in. And there's a building on this side of the gate. So here we are, there's the gate, the reconstructed gate. Here we are just inside it, and we're excavating the remains of this building here. And you can see charred brick and slate here from the demolition of that fire-damaged building. And here again, we've actually got, this was really exciting, the surviving remains of the wall under the ground. You can see there it comes up from towards the gate and then turns a corner. And it's here on this sketch. Now, this is a sketch by Dennis Dighton, who visited the battlefield within about 5 days of the fighting and made some wonderful sketches from which he created paintings. And that's through the North Gate. There's the well with the dove house on it, but look at the size of this building. And it's that corner there on the inside that we've got here, preserved archaeologically, but it gives you some idea again of this tight space as you get into the gate before you get into the courtyard. Now, if you did get into the courtyard, that's the view you would have had. Well, it's not really. It's the view you get today, because you can look straight the way through to the south gate. There's the gardener's house over the top of it. We'll come back to that. There's the chapel that survived the fire. But here would have been the chateau. On this grass platform where this tent is, would have been the chateau with a farmer's house attached to it. And attached to the edge of the chateau, and this building here, was a wall with an archway through it. So you wouldn't see any of this because this huge house would be in the way. And the reality is that there isn't one courtyard, there are two courtyards. You're in the north courtyard, and then there's a south courtyard that you would have entered into from here through this archway in this wall. So it's very easy when you visit Hougoumont today to get a misunderstanding of how the space worked, because a lot of that space, or at least the definitions between the space, the divisions, I should say, have been removed because of the buildings that were destroyed during the fire. That's why that model's important, because it reconstructs that. Now, here is that other model I was talking about, bigger than the one I showed you in the flesh, so to speak, and slightly more accurate. Not entirely. Here's the north gate. There would have been a building here in reality, but it does give you some impression of the confined space just inside that gate. There's the bottleneck with that carriage going through it. There's the well. There's the chateau with the farmhouse and the arched wall dividing the north courtyard from the south courtyard. There's the south gate. So obviously, standing here, you wouldn't be able to see the south gate. Importantly, as we'll get to, here is a gate in the south courtyard that takes you into the walled garden. So I'm going to come back to this model because it's very useful for demonstrating how the space was influencing the fight. So the French got through that north gate. It was closed behind them, and it's become, you know, an iconic scene from the Battle of Waterloo. But they also got through the west door. Now, this is the west side of the building. We described Matthew Clay and his mate fighting their way back to the gates. But there was a door here. And today, if you visit Hougoumont, the likelihood is you'll go through the entrance here and just see a door there, which takes you into the gift shop and then into the visitor centre and the place itself. And that might well be the door that was attacked by the French, in fact, broken down by the French who got inside. So there is some debate, or at least depending on which books you read, as to where that door was. Some say that, and I've just been reading Clayton's book, a modern book on Waterloo, and he says that the doorway was in this wall, which connects buildings. But this drawing from the time, again, after the battle, look at that, look at the garden wall with the loopholes, look how ragged they are on there, probably fairly accurate depiction. Here's one of the barns with the roof burnt off, but look, that door is in exactly the same place as it is today, going into a building. So to get into the courtyard from the outside, you would go through the gate into the building and then presumably through a doorway on the other side of the building as it is today. Here, if there was a doorway here, you just go straight through the wall. So just to show you on Crown's map, there's the building. So the doorway here going through that building before you get into the south courtyard. But as I said, Clayton and others have the doorway in this wall, which would again get them into the courtyard. But again, even then, they'd be in a confined space before they opened out into the wider area of the south courtyard. And that gate to the garden I showed you on the model is here. And we have an account of that incursion. This is Siborne's famous history of the Waterloo campaign, published in the 1840s. And he describes the fight at that doorway. The greatest struggle was at the western opening of the large barn. So he's saying it was in the building, the door of which was wanting. The French, determined to make good an entrance, encountered the brave Germans, equally resolute to prevent them. The foremost Frenchmen, dashing boldly on to force their way, were struck down by the deliberate fire from the rifles the instant they reached the threshold, and 17 of their dead bodies already formed a rampart for those who continued to press forward to carry on the struggle. So there's a very vivid account based on original eyewitness accounts of that fight for the doorway. But it doesn't look as though the French got far inside from what those writings tell us. And you can imagine, if they get through the doorway, they're in a building. There may have been defenders in the building, a very enclosed space. and then defenders on the outside of the building shooting through the door. So again, they get inside, but only to get trapped once they are inside. And then there is the south gate, and you've already seen a view of the south gate from the inside, and there it is in this view. So we've had the north gate, we've had the door in the west wall, and then we've got the south gate. And again, a lovely Dennis Dighton sketch from the outside, looking straight ahead to the gate. There's the gardener's house over the top of it. There's the garden wall. And you can see it's been shattered with musket shot and bigger holes. And this gate was also broken open. It's a story that's less told than the north gate, but we have several descriptions of the French getting through this gate. Now, if we go to Matthew Clay's account, he says that the French used a cannon to blow open the door not once, but twice. They blew it open the first time, it was closed and barricaded, and then they fired again and blew it open again. And French troops got in, but they didn't get very far in before they were killed. There's also another account, which is, I'm not going to read it because I don't have time, but it's an account by a German sergeant. And he too describes the gate being broken open, but not by cannon. He says that the French, as they come through the wood, and this view here is just as you're standing with your back to the wood, they cut down a tree and used it as a battering ram, medieval style, to break open the gates. So which account is the more accurate, we don't know. But it looks as though there was a cannon here. Clay goes on to then describe damage to the wider building above the gate by a cannon. And the evidence does point to a cannon getting up to the walls. And this flies in the face of a lot of the arguments as to why the French didn't use cannons to knock down the walls of Hougoumont. Well, it looks as though they did bring a cannon up, and probably through the wood. There are two trackways through the wood, up those trackways, pushing it into a position where they could shoot straight ahead at that gate and the building above it. And we'll actually come back to cannon fire against the structures in my next talk. So we have two accounts of that gate being broken open. Clay says twice. That's the interior, so that's the other side. So there's the gate, there's the gardener's house over the top of it. And you can see again, once they get in through that gate, they're in another tiny enclosed space before they break out into the wider part of the south courtyard. There's the chapel on the left. So getting through a gate or a doorway isn't the answer to what you want, because you might just end up trapped on the other side of it. Now, looking at this window up here on the first floor, I got up into the apartment there to look back into the courtyard. And this is the view you get. There's the chapel, but you can see all the way down to the north gate. There's the great barn on the left. There's our archaeologist working on that trench next to the gate. This is the grass platform. This is the location of the house. So you wouldn't have been able, if this was 1815 during the battle, you wouldn't have been able to see the north gate because the house would have been here, high enough to obscure that view. And then there would have been a wall connecting it there with the archway, which allowed you to get from the south courtyard here into the north courtyard. Now, we'll return here briefly to the fight for the north gate, because we have descriptions of that officer, Colonel James Mcdonald, first being at the gate to the garden. When the French break through, he's not at the north gate, he's up here on the other side of the south courtyard. Now here, again, the model's useful. So there's the south gate, there's the north gate, there's the chateau. So the description, Mcdonald gets down here and helps to close the gates and no doubt commands that operation. But there are several accounts in a number of the books where originally he's around here, around the gate, possibly inside the garden, when the French break through. But the thing is, when he's there, there's no way he could have seen what's happening down here. So how did he know that the French had broken through? Because what he does is he runs through with two officers. He comes through the south courtyard, through the archway, At the well, he picks up another 6 soldiers, and as a group, they rush to the gate and close the gates. How does he know what's happening here when he's over here? Does he hear it? Because he certainly can't see it. One of the books suggests he does hear it, but again, you know, he's behind buildings and walls and stuff, and there's noise all around. Would he be able to hear it? Or did someone come and fetch him? Go and get the colonel, bring him down here, we're in trouble. But that's not the only question that can be asked here, because he and those men, 2 officers from up there and then 6 men from the well, had to get through the melee, the press of men fighting in this small area to get to the gate to close it. How did they do that? How did they manage to push their way through? And if you read the history books, they just brush over this. This is basically just a paragraph or 2. But if you start to look at the space and tie that into the accounts as they exist and the descriptions in the later history books, you know, you have to ask yourself, well, how did that happen? How did he know this was happening? And how did he get there to close the gates while there are 30 or 40 French men, French soldiers inside the courtyard? It's difficult to envisage. And there are probably several stories to be told here. One alternative is that by the time Macdonald gets there, the French inside are already dead. And maybe there weren't more left outside at that time to come through. So maybe they're able to step over the dead French or the wounded or whatever and close the gates. And maybe that very straightforward operation has over time, including through the medium of art like that painting, been turned into this epic closing of the gates while the fighting is going on all around. Maybe there is another explanation that fits the evidence a little better. And we have a description of Clay, because once they'd fought their way, him and his mate had fought their way along, they come through the North Gate, and it's quite clear from his description this battle for the gate has already happened, because there are dead French soldiers in the threshold. It's a very unpleasant scene he describes. So the fight has already happened there, and he sees, as he comes through the gate, he sees Macdonald walking toward the gate with a tree trunk that he's going to use to try and block the gate closed. So, you know, there's another insight there. And in fact, he also describes Macdonald's horse lying dead or wounded close by. So when Macdonald came through here, was he actually galloping through on his horse? Did his horse help him to barge his way through the French to get to the gate to close it, locking them in? We don't know, but there are a lot of stories told about Waterloo and Hougoumont, and there are others to be told in addition. Now, what I would suggest is that you go to the sources, and they are available. These original eyewitness accounts are available, and I must here name check Gareth Glover, who's a great historian who has done much to bring the original accounts to a wider readership. And in fact, he published and edited Matthew Clay's account and very generously allowed Waterloo Uncovered to put the text on the website. So if you go to the Waterloo Uncovered website, you will see Matthew Clay's account. And from that, and using models or images, you know, all of these books have maps and plans in them, you can trace Matthew Clay's fight around Hougoumont, which takes him from the outside through the North Gate, then up to the South Gate, then into the Chateau. It's amazing, but you can put it all together. But the thing is that not all of the accounts agree. He says a cannon broke down the South Gate. That German sergeant says it was a battering ram. So please do take a look at the evidence. You can build your own pictures of what happened by piecing that evidence together. And I think if there is an overall message here, it is that one that the French, yes, they broke through and into Hougoumont, but they just got themselves into trouble because of the configuration of the spaces. Every doorway led into a trap. So they never really got far enough inside to exploit their victory at the threshold. But we'll explore that idea a little more when we talk about the garden and the orchard in the next time. In the meantime, why don't you get out there and really be a private detective. Thanks for listening.